YouTube channel after the session, probably over the weekend or closer to the weekend. And then I, of course, will send out an email just like I have in the prior sessions. So let's go ahead and get started, and we'll talk about some of those housekeeping items as well. First of all, just the agenda. Now, this is largely the same agenda as in past webinars for S10. We do those once a year, right around the beginning of the year when the S10 audit process starts. The one big change I made today, this time, is I moved up the cost reporting template discussion close to the top. Instead of the cost reporting instructions, which were usually first, and the template was usually down further. And the main reason for that is there's an important an issue, I guess. It's not a change, really. It's the opposite of a change, but there's an issue to discuss with the templates for the S10 this year. And I just wanted to make sure that's clear. Of important changes. So we'll talk about those. Then we'll cover the importance of the charity care policy or financial assistance policy. Just a refresher, a reminder on submitting documentation through the file exchange, sometimes referred to as secure EDI. And then just general discussions about the audit process, timeframes, things like that, and the special points about charity care payments and bad debts. Then we'll have a quick slide on available resources. And for questions, I have it at the end in this agenda, but feel free to ask any questions you have along the way. I've got my chat area up over on the other monitor, and I keep an eye on that. That way we can discuss the question when it's relevant. Now, I did post a survey link. It's in the chat area, and I'll repost it again when we get to the end of the session. But we certainly appreciate if you can take a few minutes. Would love if you could take a few minutes to take that survey. So you can access it through either the link or the QR code down here. Just point your phone and your camera at that, and then it'll load up the survey for you. So there's one for today and one for tomorrow for anybody that's attending that session. Now, I guess I don't have a slide for the housekeeping items, but I do want to go over those really quick. I mentioned at the beginning that we're recording the session. I'll be posting it to the YouTube channel and then eventually to our website as well. And I always send an email out. I take a look at the roster, everybody that attended that had an email address. I do want to stress that. If anybody is attending just by calling in, of course, I have no way of knowing who it is, what email to send it to, unless you were already in the initial listings from before. If you've already received an email from me about the webinar, you getting all this information. So again, expect that here. I usually wait until both sessions are over and I take a look at which one I think was the smoothest recording. And then I process that. I do a little bit of editing, cut out any empty space or anything like that, post it to the YouTube channel, get the email ready to go, and send that out. So again, I'm probably Friday, Saturday, Sunday, one of those days you should have that information out. And then the good question was asked about the CET or CPE certificates, basically the certificate of completion, if you will. Now, what I've done is the MAX staff that are attending, I've generally sent those customized CPE certificates out, or CET is the proper term there. But a good question was asked if anybody else needs one. If, let's say, you're a CPA and you're needing CPE for your credit, feel free to just send me an email and I can do that. It's not something right now I do for every single attendee, just globally, because I'm not sure how many people would actually need that. but if you do, just let me know. One of these days we'll try to work out a more automated process to do that a little more smoothly. So that's kind of the timeframes and just the housekeeping items. So now let's take a look at the timeframes for the S10 audit process. So what I have here first is just the prior year, just a reminder of what we did last year and when the information is probably going to be used. So December 31st of 2024, we wrapped up last year's audits that were for federal fiscal year 22. They're always 2 years behind just by the nature of when the cost reports are submitted. Now, that information, if CMS stays on the same process and method as they have in the past, they'll be using an average of 3 years, including this year, to determine the factor threes that'll ultimately be published in the federal fiscal year 26 Federal Register, which should be coming out here in a couple of months to about 2 months or so for the proposed rule, and then in August for the final rule. So again, that's all a possibility, but we don't know. They might change. Now, the current year, we're just now starting to audit. The letters just went out. We are doing 2023, federal fiscal year 2023. And here's the definition of that, by the way. It relates to fiscal years beginning in that federal fiscal year. So 10/1/22 to 9/30/23. We're starting these. I put in 3/10 just because that's the initial due date for the documentation. Although I do want to stress, if you need an extension for that, certainly feel free to reach out to your auditor. Which that's actually another good point I wanted to make here. With the initial requests that went out, there was some verbiage, and I think I put it in the email that I sent out, a copy after the mail went out. It mentions that if you basically, before you submit your documentation, you'll need to wait for your auditor to reach out to contact you. Because if you've used the Secure EDI before, the way it's set up for security purposes is that you can't communicate with an auditor unless they've already reached out to you at some point. It might have been years ago. You might have been in contact with that auditor a long time ago. The connection is established. You can reach out to them on your own now. But let's say it's a new auditor or you've never worked with them. You won't be able to just blindly send something in to them. You have to wait for them to reach out to you. Now, also, if you don't have an account set up yet for Secure EDI, File Exchange, them sending the first email essentially opens that account up, and then they'll send you the password as well. So the point is they'll be reaching out to you very shortly here. They've been assigned. They're reaching out to everybody. They're going through their lists. And if you need an extension, reach out to that auditor. They can work with you and get that extension logged. And again, they'll open your account up through Secure EDI so that you can send the information in. So we just generally put in that month time frame up front. We know some people are ready to go with it. Others, it might take a little longer to get the templates ready, and that's perfectly fine. The due date for us to complete our final audit work, just like the past years, is December 31st. Of course, we try to wrap that up a little bit before then because these have to be processed on the back end as well. Now, again, to be used for, we can only speculate. We assume they're going to continue on a 3-year average. There have been discussions for a variety of things. Who knows, they might change, but we're just speculating it'll be some sort of average there. So I just put some time frames in for when that information will likely be published or proposed. So again, what cost report periods are included? We start off with the fiscal years in federal fiscal year 2023. So that is fiscal year begins 10/1/22 through 9/30/23, which basically converts, if you're looking at a fiscal year end, which is the more common way of looking at it, we're talking 9/30/23 through 8/31/24 fiscal year ends. Now, we have a small handful, especially like the 8/31s, the 7/31s, that might not have even come in yet, and certainly might not be finalized yet at that point, or not finalized, accepted. Let's see, I got a question here. Waiting room. I guess I'm not sure why it's not automatically letting people in. I don't have any access to a waiting room on my side here. That is odd. Has anybody else just called in and got in without any trouble? Hmm. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, I don't have any. There's nothing. There's no control for me at this point. Uh, oh, you just got in. Okay, so maybe it's maybe there's a delay or something like that. But yeah, I have no. I'm not even called in. I'm on my computer microphone. So okay. Oh yeah, yeah. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, they need to join as a guest. So I'm not. If there's an option there, make sure to join. Obviously, that's not going to help anybody that's trying to call in right now. They can't hear me. But if you happen to be in communication with somebody that's having those issues, let them know that they need to join as a guest. So sounds good. Thank you. So yeah, again, the fiscal year ends. We have about 9/30/23 through 8/31/24. Now the information request letters went out for the ones we have. There's a small handful that we haven't sent out because we're waiting on the cost report to come in, basically to see, first of all, what is the year end or what is the period itself, and also have they reported dish? Because if they have not reported dish, they're not going to be subject to the audit unless they report dish through an amended cost report down the road, for example. Now, a couple of the rules here for the audit selection: there's only one audit performed per provider per year, per calendar year, I should say. So if you happen to have short cost reporting periods, the longest one that began in that federal fiscal year 23 that we're looking at is the one we are going to review. It might be a non-standard cost report, might even be longer than 12 months, but we're going to be looking at that longest one out of the potential 2 or 3. The other thing about that, though, even though we're only going to audit one, and this is a good point to make for later as well, the audit requirements are separate from cost report acceptance requirements. There are a few things that are different. One big thing we're going to talk about in a bit, but the requirement to submit documentation with the initial cost report that's been around for a while, that applies to every single year, even if it's one of those short periods that we're not going to audit. And for the past year, it's been an even more stringent requirement because that's checked up front. If there's no documentation, the cost report cannot be accepted. It'll be automatically rejected if you submitted it through MECREF, the MCR-EF system. So just a reminder that the listing is needed for all periods, and then we'll select the one that's the longest one if that case comes up to actually audit. Again, the audit covers all hospitals that have reported DISH, and that's on E-Part A, line 34. So now we have another difference that I was just talking about between the cost report acceptance and the S10 audit. The audit currently requires us to, or the audit, basically CMS requires us to audit even SCH providers that might have a higher hospital-specific rate than the federal payment. So I know that sounds odd. It's been that way for a few years here, and we'll see the Federal Register reference to that. But the point is, it is different than the actual cost report. Time of cost report submission. However, we're still going to need to request it when we do the audit. Now, at some point, it would be great if that gets, if those get aligned, those two requirements, but it's been a few years. It's been in the Federal Register. They haven't been aligned yet. One can still hope that they might be aligned. But again, we are still required to do that. You know, one of the explanations CMS gives us for that and gives providers for that is that there is the chance, and it's not a complete rarity, where a provider might have a hospital-specific payment that's higher than the federal payment now, but something could have adjusted that DISH uncompensated care, as well as a lot of other things that would bump it above the hospital-specific payment. So that's one of the reasons they're giving. Again, they might align those requirements down the road, but for right now, we are still required to audit the SCH hospitals. Now, the cost reporting instructions, and you know what, the one thing I forgot to change, it says they're the same as they are in the past 3 years. That's absolutely not the case. This year they changed. Now, again, though, we're still using multiple cost reports for factor 3. We talked about that, an average. So this is just a little verbiage from the Federal Register where they talk about that. Now, this is the piece that I was talking about for the SCH hospitals. This came from the 2021 final rule, and a commenter specifically asked about whether or not the SCH hospitals had to be audited. And CMS's response is yes. Basically, they go through kind of their justification. So right here, we note that all hospitals are required to maintain documentation for cost reporting, including Worksheet S-10, and there's some uncertainty whether a hospital will ultimately be paid on that hospital-specific rate because, again, terminated, they're never going to see any result from this payment or from this factor 3 that we'd be calculating. So CMS knows they don't need that data. And this also, when we say termination, it includes acute care hospitals that have converted to another provider type. Now, mostly that's a critical access hospital, could be a long-term care hospital, could be a variety of things. But if they're no longer an acute care hospital, they're not going to be reimbursed DSH uncompensated care in later years. So again, there's no reason at all to have this data. It's not going to be used. That being said, when we talk about the critical access hospital, they're not subject to the S-10 audit at all. And like we just said, they're the rehab hospitals, long-term cares. None of them are subject to the S-10 audit. However, there's still a little piece of the Worksheet S-10 cost reporting instructions that say the section 1886D, which is the acute care hospital, and the critical access hospitals are required to complete this worksheet. So CAWs are technically still required to complete S-10 itself, but they're never required to submit documentation for it, for acceptance or for an S-10 audit. Now, I suspect it really kind of needs to be removed at some point. The only reason it ever existed was for the EHR incentive payments years ago. In those situations, in fact, that was the first use of S-10 before we even had DSH uncompensated care. So they were required to submit it there because it factored into that incentive payment. It no longer applies. Again, I can only go by what the instructions are saying. I can tell you that there's currently no reason to look at the CAW data, but again, I can't say you don't need to do it because that would contradict the instructions. So we'll just kind of leave it at that. Now, again, we said if you have DSH, if you've reported DSH on the cost report, you will be subject to the S-10 audit. Now, maybe you didn't report it initially. Maybe you didn't quite qualify for DSH, and then maybe a new SSI ratio is issued, or you have amended your Medicaid days, and now all of a sudden you qualify for DSH. That, if you now have DSH eligibility, that would be potentially subject to an S-10 audit once that is found out, once that is identified. Now, that's especially important because this data is not just being used for 1 year anymore. In the past, there was a little bit of a concern, well, hey, what if that amendment doesn't come in until after all the analysis is done for that uncompensated care payment? And that's still partially true, but since the data is used for 3 years to average out for 3 different payments, it's still going to become important. Even if it's a little late for this first year, it'll be important for the other 2 years. So the point here, just to kind of summarize, is it's important to submit that data as soon as you have it ready so that we can take a look at that and hopefully get it in the current year's audit cycle. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because it's the exact same thing for the past several years, but I just wanted to reiterate that the uncompensated care payment that you're going to get is the product of 3 different factors. The UCP Factor 1 is a national pool of DISH uncompensated care payments, or a pool available for those DISH uncompensated care payments. And basically, it's that 75% of the original DISH payments that were carved out of traditional DISH. And that factor updates every year. It gets multiplied by Factor 2, which is a reduction factor. And again, that's every year. It's due to an expected decrease in the number of uninsured patients. Sometimes it fluctuates a bit. And then, we don't audit that. That's CMS that gathers that information nationally. Factor 3 is what we're doing right now. That's what the S10 audits are all about. This identifies each individual hospital's specific share of that pool, basically 1 multiplied by 2. So Factor 3 tells them how much of that pool they will get in the later years. And that's where the S10 data comes into play. And again, we have these slides here. Don't really need to spend much time to go through them. They're rounded anyways. They're not super accurate. Got a couple slides showing the final payment, the final pool amount, if you will, for 2025. And it's basically the 10 billion, 10.5 billion multiplied by 54.29%. That gives you the $5.7 billion pool that every hospital is going to share in based on their Factor 3. Again, that's why we're doing the S10 audits, to make sure everybody gets the appropriate share. Just a little comparison to last year. If we look, this year's ends up being 5.7 billion. Last year was a little bit higher, 5.9 billion. So the difference is, partially Factor 1, but also Factor 2 is 5% different. So that's a little bit of the overview here. And now let's head into some of the information. These next few slides are really just talking about some different things we've learned throughout the years of auditing. And I do want to mention, by the way, that this is not just a one MAC at a time type thing. Yes, every MAC has their workload, but we do work together. We actually have regular work group meetings. We call them kind of collaboration meetings across all the MACs, where we have all the MACs, a couple contacts there to talk certain issues through, to identify things, just see what everybody's seeing. We do the same thing on the back end to kind of get a lessons learned type of thing. And that's where a lot of this stuff came from. And we also have meetings with CMS and their contractor as well. But one of the lessons we learned was, by the way, some of this will change a little bit whenever we get to the new template, which again, I'm kind of alluding to that later. But the format of the submitted listings, that's been an issue for quite a while. It did get a little cleaner over the past few years, but the number of requested data fields, now again, that actually increases a bit whenever we get to the T18 templates, which, assuming we get to the T18 templates for S10 audits. But again, it's still quite a few fields. That's the point. Missing data elements from the logs. Sometimes there are situations where some of the fields are not really all that relevant. We don't necessarily need them to do the review, but other fields we really can't even proceed without them. So that was certainly a concern if we don't have data elements that are necessary. The size of the resulting files. Now, this isn't nearly as bad as it used to be. Much of this related to, for those of you that have done this for a while, much of this related to when you had to have a separate line for every single revenue code in that claim. Now, that might still be the case for some of you, but in many situations, the physician and professional fees, you've stated that you store that in a separate system. And if you can attest to that, that all of a sudden eliminates the need for separate lines for separate revenue codes. So that really streamlines the file. And then the verbiage of query logic, that phrase that's used, when we ask for this, and we even call our questionnaire that we'll go through a little later, we call it the query logic questionnaire, but that takes on more of a technical term than it really needs to be. We were looking for a narrative, an explanation of things. How did you query your system? How did you find this data and make sure you've carved out something that's not allowable? So that's the type of thing we're looking for. We're not looking for any sort of database programming scripts like SQL or whatever else you might use. So that was one piece of confusion from the past. Timeline obstacles, it's a crunched time frame, although it's nowhere near as bad as the wage index process for those of you that might be involved with that. And for the most part, we get almost the entire year. We start these things in February, and we found the earliest start is the best. Everybody's getting done December 31st. There's usually going to be at least a month because, again, a lot of those cost reports haven't even been submitted yet. So we start the ball rolling somewhere around early February. We get things moving on our side, get the letters out, get the universe identified. But we've identified definitely that the earliest start date is the best. And also, CMS tries to use the best data available. So they wait for us to complete our audits, and they try to pull the latest run of HICRIS data so they can do their analysis on their side. One of the complaints that both providers and MACs have had is that it overlaps with wage index reviews, which I just said is already a crunch time frame. But again, there's just no way out of it. Wage index review, we've brought that up with CMS many times in the past. That data is it's a crunch time period. They need it at a certain time. You can't start it too early because the provider side won't have the information in. So that's a crunch time frame, but we certainly can't say, well, our S10 audits need to be done before the wage index starts. There's just no time. Now all of a sudden S10 would be crunched as well. And in fact, it would be crunched to a smaller window than is even really feasible. So it's just the nature of things. It's unfortunate. There's just a lot of things going on. And I know that's in addition to your normal cost report filings, as well as any regular desk review or audit that might be going on. Again, it's just a lot of things that need to be done, and there's only the year to do them. They can't be pushed forever, basically. It's just kind of the unfortunate nature of it. Now, this one is a big lesson that was learned, and CMS reiterates this to us quite a bit as MACs, and we reiterate it to our staff. There is a big preference for cleaning the listing up front before we get to the sample selection phase, because if we don't find the obvious errors up front to clean them out, then the only way the error will be taken care of is if we have the back end extrapolation. So if we extrapolate whatever errors we might find. Now, statistically, it's supportable, but again, it's so much better from a kind of a qualitative perspective to identify that information up front, and then it's clean. Now our sample will not include those types of errors. So the only way this works, though, is if we have properly submitted data on the right template with the right fields that we need. And a big thing is the understanding of the query logic. So that's why we have that questionnaire that was built years ago with input from all the MACs. We ask the questions just so we understand, and we can hopefully obviously identify if there was a mistake made in the data gathering, and then we can work with you to get the revised listing before we even start the detailed testing. Now, some issues of inconsistent sampling. This issue has come up in the past with many other issues outside of S10 with bad debts, DISH. CMS has stated multiple times they're not planning on making a requirement, a certain method of sampling a requirement. They do require that it be statistically valid, but even in financial statement audits, any sort of audits, there are multiple ways to sample, multiple methodologies. Sometimes they arrive at different sample sizes, but it must be supportable. That's the key thing there. Another unfortunate one that we always try to eliminate: communication breakdowns. Sometimes it's as simple as not having the proper point of contact on the front end. Things change, people move to new positions, move to new companies. So we certainly try to identify those up front. And one of the good things is since I went back to sending an email out. I know we did not do that the prior year. We just sent the letters out, but I went back to that this year using the contacts that we had from what the auditors reported last year. So they updated contact listing, and even in that few month time frame, we found that people again have changed. So at least we know up front who the proper contact is, and we in turn update the contact listing so that the auditor can reach out to now the new contact. Another thing that was discussed was the use of multiple auditors makes coordination difficult. Now, I think that might be from a chain perspective. There are, just by the nature of it, I mean, there's no way we could have one auditor handle the entire big chains. I mean, that just doesn't make sense. So they definitely have to have multiple auditors working with the different providers. We assign them out. There should not generally be a situation where a unit gets switched from one auditor to the next. Obviously, there would be some exceptions if an auditor leaves, for example, or is out ill. In those situations, that could come up, but for the most part, they wouldn't. And of course, the question of time to review or respond to adjustments, insufficient time. So, we try to make sure our auditors send those out with plenty of time there. Now, going back and forth, if there are adjustments one time and then some new data comes in and adjustments again, we certainly would not be able to continue to wait 2 weeks every single time. That just eats up the time like crazy. And the revised adjustments should be fairly small in number anyways at that point. Now, education and training opportunities. Obviously, this right here is a training opportunity. We try to put this on every year, and CMS and their contractor, they provide training for us as a MAC. So just information on the different types or frequency of errors being seen across the country. What we're going to find out today in our webinar is that, again, the cost reporting instructions have changed. And anytime you see change, there's a little bit of concern. It increases the risk, the inherent risk of a mistake, just because people are used to doing things one way and then all of a sudden something changes. So now we have just a point about the initial S10 request letters. They went out on February 11th, and the information is due initially by 3/10. But again, feel free to reach out to your auditor if you need an extension, and that's perfectly fine. We understand that. Now, the big question that I wanted to talk about before we get into all the detail is what templates to use. Now, I see there's a question out here on the chat area about that. 2 times now we've had meetings. All MACs were involved. CMS and their contractor was involved, and they stated that we are to use the original template, the same template that we've been using all along, not the T18 templates. I'm not sure where the confusion is. I know you mentioned that some of the other MACs are using that. We just confirmed with them again on last Friday, and they reiterated yet again that what we're saying is correct. The original templates need to be used, not the T18 templates. So kind of going back to what we said earlier, what I've brought up a few different times, a difference or distinction between what's required at acceptability and what's required for the S10 audit, or any audit for that matter. And I think I have a slide there. Yeah, I do. So I guess first of all, I just wanted to mention this. This link takes you to the original template and the query logic questionnaire. We'll open that up here in just a little bit. It's on the website, but I don't want to break up the discussion too much. When we talk about these T18 templates, Transmittal 18 is what that stands for. It's Transmittal 18 of the hospital cost report form set. Now, this whole T18, these templates are an extension of a requirement that started in 8/17 of 2018, that Federal Register. Basically, that Federal Register, and it eventually was a regulatory requirement that stated when you submit your cost report with either Medicare bad debts, DISH, Medicaid days, or charity care, you must have some sort of listing basically reconciling the amounts, some sort of support showing what that amount is. Now, that's not necessarily what's going to be audited for a couple of reasons. We know, especially with DISH, it's extremely likely that providers are going to amend their DISH days between the time they accept the cost report and when it ultimately gets finalized. Same thing with S10. There would be many situations, and we've seen many situations, where the charity care that's submitted initially at acceptance has been revised by the time we get to the S10 audit. Now, the thing with this is that we the exhibits here, the transmittal 18 exhibits, again, those are required for cost report submission. Now, when you talk about regulation, that's the only regulation there is, that these are required for cost report submission. There is no regulation saying that one is or is not required for S10 audit. However, there's information on the audit program, and MACs certainly have the authority and the requirement to request the documentation that's needed to complete our desk reviews and audit. And as we'll get to in just a bit, there are a few fields or a few steps in the audit program that require us to use, and I'll just point out the one big item, transaction codes. We are required to gather transaction codes. We cannot do the audit program without the transaction codes. Now, that field, for whatever reason, has been removed from the T18 templates that are used for the cost report acceptance. It is still required for the S10 audit. That's by far the biggest difference, but we'll see some of the differences in a bit, some of the other differences both ways. But the point is, these T18 templates for all these different issues, they relate solely, at least at this point, they relate solely to this requirement that your cost report submission have some listing. Initially, before 10.1.22, in other words, between 8.17.18 and 10.1.22, there was not a requirement for exactly what that listing looked like. It just had to be a reasonable listing that supported your amount. Now with 10.1.22 and after, these T18 templates, there's a clear exhibit for what that listing must look like. Now, there's still no requirement that you use somebody's specific Excel spreadsheet, whether it be CMS's or WPS's or anybody. You can build your own template, but it has to follow the headers and the order that's given to you. So it kind of behooves you just to use one that's already been created in that case. So that is the point about this. The T18 templates relate to this cost report submission requirement only. And now we're on to the point about the cost report submission requirement versus the S10 audit documentation requirement. So at acceptability, the reason that regulation came into effect was that CMS was concerned that some of these, and they saw, in fact, they knew this was happening. Some of the numbers that were coming in were just thrown onto the cost report without really, with an apparent lack of documentation behind it. In other words, the number that eventually came in was significantly different. In many cases, CMS found that the exact same number from the prior year was just thrown on the cost report just to get it in the door. And they didn't like that idea. A tentative settlement is done based on the data. And a lot of times at tentative settlement, there's not going to be much of a review depending on the issue. So their big concern was that they were getting poor data and potentially erroneous settlements because providers might not have been even putting together a document to get the proper amount to put on. Again, things might change, but when you see a prior year number being used exactly in the current year, that's a pretty big red flag that there's a mistake. So that's why this acceptability requirement came into play. They felt that if providers were required to prove with documentation to build a list, that it's much more likely the amount that's going on there is at least reasonably accurate. So just the fact that a provider has to put the listing together provides a little bit of reasonable assurance, as opposed to just throwing a number on there. Now, the S10 audit, and any audit for that matter, we are looking for documentation that's necessary for a more thorough examination of that underlying data. And again, we'll talk about sampling. We'll talk about that upfront analysis. And that is, as I said, the key distinction between the acceptability piece and the S10 audit is that transaction code, where that in and of itself enables us to do a heck of a lot of upfront analysis that we just simply can't do without. And until and unless CMS changes the audit program to remove all those steps and just solely rely on extrapolation, we need that data. That's the point there. So, or the other way they might go is, which would be perspective, they might go the other way and say, hey, for this, what we now call the T18 template, maybe they'll finally add that piece back, and then they might tell us we can use the same template for both. But right now we're in the first year of these templates, and again, we have 3 times we've gotten confirmation from CMS and their contractor that we are required to use that template, that old template. So now let's talk about, let's see, we have a question here. So if a cost report S10 listing was T18, do you need the original template for S10 audits? Yes, exactly. So you would have submitted the T18 template when you submitted the cost report. And if we're doing an audit, again, if it has DISH and we're doing an audit on it, then we would need to see this old template. Many of the fields are the same. Again, there's the one major difference is the fact that transaction code, which is right here, here's the old template, this column D, payment transaction code, that is not on the T18 templates. And without that, and by the way, what that is for people that might not be all that familiar, that is basically that template, or that payment transaction code shows, it's from each person's system, each provider's system, which the numbers are going to be completely different, but we need an index or a legend to understand your transaction codes. But the point is that helps us to identify, is this charity care? Was this written off as bad debt? Was it written off as an uninsured discount? What was it written off as? What do these amounts relate to? Without that, there's just no way of looking at a listing and saying, well, hey, that obviously shouldn't be allowed because that's not even a charity care. Might be a patient payment, might be all sorts of other things that would not be allowable. Without that code, we would be forced to go through, pick a sample, and if we happen to find that one item, then now all of a sudden, maybe that was only an error in a few lines of your listing somehow, but if that happened to make it to the sample, that would be extrapolated to an amount far, far, far greater than what the error was. And the exact opposite could hold true as well. If that was an error only a few times, there's probably a pretty good chance we're not even going to find it in the sample. And now all of a sudden your amounts are overstated. So that's the importance of that upfront analysis, carving those obvious errors out. And again, without the payment transaction code, we cannot do it. Now, I will state that, we've brought this up 3 times to the CMS and the contractor, and they are going to bring it up again to the other MACs here in just about 2 weeks, I believe, just as another reminder that we are supposed to use those old templates. So just wanted to mention that. Let's see. So let's go through these templates and point out the differences. Some of them are not that important of a difference, and some of this information we could actually do without as kind of a compromise to the transition between the 2 templates. There have been a few fields that have been contentious for years anyways, and at this point we can just go without them. But let's take a look here. We have insurance status, whether they're uninsured or insured. That determines which column they go into, so that's a pretty important item. The primary and secondary payer, we need to know who those are. That helps us to identify, is it truly insured, and what remittance advice should we expect, or what documentation should we expect. We talked about payment transaction code, some sort of identification number. Now notice this is not a HIC number or an MBN number, and obviously part of the reason is they're not all Medicare patients, but we just need to know, we need some identification number for that patient so that we can sample, we can request documentation from you easily. We'll just leave it at that. Patient name, Now, these three columns right here are the ones that are a little more contentious: patient birth date, social security number, and patient gender. If we go right to left, patient gender, I really don't know why that was ever in any of these templates. That might be relevant for some audits, but it serves zero purpose for S10. So, we can do without that column. I know in the past, in earlier years, there was a big push starting from CMS through Max that every single field needed to be filled out. But at this point, we can make a little bit of a compromise, and we've had to do it on a case-by-case basis anyways. Gender, social security number, again, we have an identification number. The social security number, there have been a lot of concerns due to just PHI. This was removed in the new template. And again, as kind of a compromise, we can do without this column as well. And the only thing, again, those two wouldn't have served a purpose. Patient birth date, about the only benefit that would have ever offered is that if you see somebody that was over 65, then hey, there's a high risk, it's a Medicare patient, and should they really be on the charity care listing? It's just a higher risk class. But because especially if we've been using the T18 templates, and if you don't have the easy ability of getting the patient birth date, that's another field we could probably do without. It served very little purpose. So hopefully that'll help at least those three fields eliminating. J, K, and L, those fields were all still needed: admit date, discharge date, whether it's inpatient or outpatient. Now, I guess I do have to stress this, and this is another oddity. This was actually removed from the T18 charity care listing, but it was left on the T18 bad debt listing, total bad debt listing, for some odd reason. This is actually another field that if you have trouble getting it and adding it to the listing, we can probably do without this field as well. And the main purpose it ever served was to give us the ability to sample different universes. But honestly, high dollar, low dollar tends to give us very similar results here. So I would feel comfortable, if you're having trouble getting this, I'd feel comfortable leaving this out as well. Now, revenue code, that is no longer at all on the T18 template. So there's revenue code, and then there's revenue code total charges for the claim. If you look at the template, the existing template, the old template for revenue code, there's actually a note underneath of it that says, hey, if you have your physician and professional fees separated into a different system, then don't bother reporting a revenue code. This column's not really even needed. You do not need to break your claim out into multiple revenue code lines. That being said, many providers had that attestation, and that really shrunk down the listing. So if you still have that attestation, if you still keep them separate, then again, this is not required anyways. This column, and I'll get back to this one more time in a second, but this revenue code total charges for the claim, it's basically just total charges. So don't really let the revenue code piece fool you. This is total charges, and it's been on every template we've had. We'll go through what purpose it serves. It's the starting point for all the other calculations, but we definitely need total charges. That's been there all along. Now, going back to revenue code again, though, let's say you do not have the attestation. So let's say your professional and physician fees are commingled with the rest of your data. That's where we're going to have a little bit of a risk, and that was the only reason that was ever included to begin with, was to give us some way to pull out professional fees and make sure they're carved out before we do our detailed testing. So that might be a situation where we could work with you if you're having trouble getting the revenue codes in there, and if you need them, if your physician and professional fees are commingled with everything else and you have no obvious way of carving them out. If you're having trouble getting the revenue code into this template, that's something we might be able to work with you. We're going to need some way of being able to carve it out, but we might be able to work with you on some alternative potentially. So right off the bat, from these old templates, we've basically hit a compromise here where we've knocked out some of the fields that have been knocked out in the T18 template. The one we just cannot knock out is the payment transaction code that serves far too great of a purpose to just toss away. And CMS has made it clear we do have to review that. We cannot pass on those steps in the audit program. Again, within the past week, we've had the third confirmation of that. So down to the rest of the fields. Most of these are, well, most of them are fairly obvious. The date of write-off to charity care, pretty straightforward. Because it has to be written off in this cost reporting period, that's what we're trying to grab. Now, the order of these, by the way, is a little off, and it was cleaned up in the T18 template. I think the date was moved over by itself, and then all the amounts that are used for a calculation are in order. So the way this works is we take the total charges, that's our starting point, and we look at all the different pieces of those total charges. I like to refer to them as the disposition of those charges. Where did they go? Some amounts were paid by patients. Some amounts were paid by third parties. This in the new template is actually at the end because it's the end result. It's the patient charity care contractual amount. What is the amount we want to allow? We're trying to back into this allowable number by identifying how much of the total charges was not already eaten up by other things, patient payments, third-party payments, and just other contractual items that are not allowed. An insurance contractual adjustment, a courtesy discount that's not allowed, just other things. So R is kind of the goal there. We're trying to back into what R is. Now, that being said, there's one more column at the end that's going to it's going to be a little bit of complexity with the new cost reporting instructions. But this field at the end, this column T, is basically, it was built for that line 25 of worksheet S10 that we'll see in just a bit. It related to non-covered charges for days exceeding the length of stay limit for patients covered by Medicaid or other indigent care. This amount in column T must also be part of column R. These are not two completely distinct fields. T is a small subset, if any, of column R. So that's an important thing to understand. The other important thing to understand, though, which will make more sense when we get to the cost reporting instructions, is that this label, this is one problem with the old template. This label is no longer quite all-inclusive because now this column T has to cover two separate lines on S10, 25 and 25.01. And I'll mention them now, and then we'll get to them again later. But 25 is still the same. It's this non-covered charges for the Medicaid length of stay limit. 25.01 relates to an insured patient that, for example, has exhausted their benefits. So part of the stay is allowable, part of the stay is not. And they might also have other situations where just part of the stay is allowable, part's not. In the past, that type of thing, that bill would be split between S10 line 20 column 1 and column 2. Now CMS has created a new line to reflect that. And I don't want to dig too deep into get too deep in the weeds until we see it in just a bit. But the point is, this non-covered charity care charges, this column T needs to cover both of those lines. And again, both of them are subsets of what's already reported in column R. So I'll swing back to that in a bit. It'll hopefully make a little more sense. But the label, if you just strictly read this label, it's not going to cover everything. Now, payments, it's very rare, especially in these current years, that you're going to have to fill out this payment template. It follows most of the same format as the other one. And by the way, there's not even a T18 payment template. They just didn't build one. But if you do have a material amount of payments that were by the way, this is not just any patient payment. This is when a payment was written off to charity care, yet the patient still comes back and pays against that charity care. That's all line 22 is for. It's rare for two reasons. One of them is if the patient was written off to charity care, I certainly know it happens, but it's not all that common for the patient to still want to pay on it. It's not unheard of, but it's not super common. Second, we've heard from many providers that actually have a policy against it. They say if it's written off to charity care, as soon as that patient payment comes in, they're going to return it. So for those two reasons, this is a pretty rare listing to need. Total bad debts. This is for line 26. And again, it's very similar to the charity care listing. So a lot of the same fields. Again, the social security number, birth date, gender, we can compromise and do without there. Here you have that same revenue code issue, the write-offs, and all those, what I call charge components, helping to explain what happened to all those total charges and what amount is left that could possibly be the bad debt amount. Now, just to stress here, a huge red flag that comes up as part of our review is if you add up all these individual columns and they exceed the total charges. That doesn't make sense. You can't have more pieces of a total than you do the total. So that would be a red flag we'd ask about right away. But the inverse is not true. You might very well have a situation where, let's say this was $15,000 for total charges. Maybe if you add up these pieces, you only come up with $12,000. That might tell us that maybe there's $3,000 the patient is still required to pay and might still be paying. So, yeah, I mean, there's a few different things that could happen there, but that's perfectly fine. That would be a good explanation for that. Now let's get into the T18. I just wanted to bring them up to point out those differences that we talked about, similarities and differences. A lot of the patient claim information is the same. Now they just call it generally a patient account number, still have insurance status and primary and secondary payer. But now the logic, the flow of these amount carve-outs, if you will, really makes more sense. Start with total charges. They're backing out all these different things to finally, down here, get to your different potential charity care items. So again, they even bring in bad debts. So out of these total charges, some of them might have been written off as bad debt. Therefore, we don't want to allow them as charity care. There might be some uninsured discounts that may be allowable if it's in your policy. And here's that column that goes back to the column T in the other one, the charity care non-covered charges. This is a better explanation or better label, if you will, compared to this, because this is very specific for that one thing that was on line 25. This is what we actually are needing now for line 25 and 25.01. It covers both of those. Charity care non-covered charges for a few different situations that we'll see in just a bit. Other charity care charges, these are, the word other you kind of think of as miscellaneous. This is probably going to be the larger of the two numbers. This is your core, these are other charity care charges that are not allowable. 20 is what we need. The amounts written off to charity care and uninsured discounts. That's the big amount that will go to line 20. So basically 18, if you have anything here, this could potentially go to, well, actually 17. No, let me back up. 18 is what's going to go in line 25 and 25.01. 17 and 20 are generally what's going to go in line 20. Now, again, these other charity care charges, this generally reflects items that are not allowable for one reason or another. They still might be charity care, but they weren't allowed by your policy. So just different things going on there. And then the write-off date at the very end, just out of the way. So again, the one thing you're missing on this template is the transaction code, which is why we can't rely solely on this template. Total bad debts, basically the same order for the most part, same setup. They start with total charges. They're backing out things that are not allowable to identify things that are allowable as patient bad debt. So here's a summary of what we just said. The SSN, date of birth, gender, they were moved in T18 templates. Talked about how the inpatient outpatient was removed from charity care but left in total bad debt, and revenue code detail was removed from T18, although again, many providers didn't even need it in the old template anymore due to that note. And as we said, this is the payment transaction code. That's the biggest issue by far. We need this to be able to do an upfront analysis on that listing and clean out anything that might have been put in there in error. Now, there might not be a mistake. You might have gathered just the charity care charges that you need, but we need to have reasonable assurance of that, and CMS requires us to review it. This is one of the ways we do it. We get an understanding of what your codes mean, and then we essentially filter and search for the codes that don't fit the ones that are charity care, uninsured discounts, or whatever. Now, the other thing about that is maybe you think you reported it properly. Maybe we find that, let's say, uninsured discounts. They could certainly be allowed if they're specified in your policy. Let's say they're not specified in your policy. Now, all of a sudden, we have to remove those. If we didn't have that transaction code, we would not be able to remove them. We wouldn't be able to get assurance that we were removing the right amount. So again, it's an audit program requirement. CMS has not revised our audit program for this year. We've been in discussions with them, and it just hasn't been revised. So we do have to use the old template to be able to cover all those audit program requirements. And I already mentioned that column T, and we're going to see this in the cost reporting instructions in just a bit. So yeah, we're just talking about the same thing there. We are going to be working with CMS to see, what does this mean for next year? Hopefully they can make whatever change they're going to make on either side sooner rather than later, to give both parties, providers and MACs, the ability to get used to them and be familiar with them. But that, again, did not happen this year. So now what I wanted to do, since we're talking about the templates right now, I just wanted to open up the query logic questionnaire and just talk about some of the questions, why we're asking them, and just what it means. I'm not going to go through necessarily every single step. Some of them I can capture in just one discussion covers a few of them. But in the charity care section, we've got it broken out by charity care, payment, and bad debts. And the idea is to get a narrative explanation about how you went through and ensured that your listing met the rules, essentially. How you gathered the right data to meet the rules of what's allowed and what's not allowed. So first of all, the first one is just, how did you make sure that your listing only included charity care write-offs in this period? It doesn't matter when the service date took place. If it was written off in this period, we need it in this listing. So again, it's just a quick assurance from you that, yeah, we did this, we filtered. We don't need all the technical detail, the scripts or anything like that. Now, I will mention these steps, not only do they serve to help us get assurance about how it was done, but they also kind of serve as a mini training session for anybody on the provider side that's going through it. It's almost like a checklist. Well, it is a checklist, I guess, but it's a reminder, step by step. Hey, make sure you did this. Make sure you did this. Here's what's allowable. This is not allowable. So that's another purpose of it. So how did you ensure that no charity care was duplicately written off in 2 years? And if you allow partial write-offs in 1 year and then another part in the next year, just make sure, that would be valid there. We just need to know if your policy says that. Again, here, 3, what transaction codes? This is where we're getting the understanding of what your transaction codes are. What are the charity care write-off codes? What are bad debt write-off codes? Other contractual adjustments, we need to know that. Number 4, how do you ensure that no claims are reported in both charity care and bad debt, unless, of course, it's a split claim again? Maybe the patient owed, $1,000, and you gave them a 60% charity care write-off, so they don't have to pay that. That portion could be in charity care, but then the other 40%, maybe you expected them to pay, and they still didn't pay it. Maybe that makes its way to bad debt, maybe even in a different year. And that's perfectly fine. We just need to understand what methods you're using. Now, number 5 is one of those red flags. It's not that it's not allowable ever, but it's a red flag that we need to look at. Do you have any Medicare patients that were reported as charity care on line 20? If so, how did you ensure these were not already written off as Medicare bad debt? And more importantly, maybe why were they not written off as Medicare bad debt? Because generally speaking, dollar for dollar, you're going to get a lot more money on the Medicare bad debt side than what it'll flow down to on the charity care side. So it just seems odd, unless there's a reason, it seems odd that a Medicare patient would make its way to charity care instead of Medicare bad debt. One very valid reason is that you didn't meet the Medicare bad debt requirements. Maybe it's an indigent requirement you didn't meet. With S10, the requirements are much less stringent than on the Medicare indigent bad debt side. So that may very well be your explanation for why they're written off on line 20 instead of Medicare bad debt on E-Part A, for example. Number 6, does your policy discuss allowing charity care approval for amounts related to insured patients that have exhausted their benefits? And if so, how did you ensure that they were properly reported, basically? How did you ensure that exhausted benefit piece was carved out? And now it actually needs to be reported on that line 25.01 that we said, whereas before it was reclassed to column 1. How about non-covered services? So flat out services that were not covered. Again, how did you ensure that they were reported properly? We're going to go through all the instructions for the different non-covered instructions because they're still not fully consistent. There is a situation or a couple situations where you will still reclass, split it, so to speak, between column 2 and column 1. So there are essentially 3 different ways it's currently handled, and I agree it's frustrating. We actually proposed a few years ago, that why not just split everything instead of having a line 25, a line 25.01, and then split some. We actually recently got a potential reason for it, and it makes a little bit of sense, but not for Medicare. It might be more for the Medicaid programs that use this data. It sounds like some Medicaid programs actually need those specific things. The Medicaid length of stay limit exclusions, the exhausted benefits, for example, they need those numbers to be able to carve out on their side. I don't know any detail, but at least we finally got a reason. We never had a reason before. So yeah, we'll talk about non-coverage later. There are situations where an entity does not have a contractual relationship with the hospital. Again, how did you ensure to cover those the proper way? We'll cover all 3 of those things in just a bit. And then here, that exceeded length of stay limit, that'll lump up with those as well. Have you included any amounts related to a self-pay discount for uninsured patients? And if so, what section of your policy allows this? How did you make sure that no physician or professional services were included? And that's either by filtering out certain revenue codes, or maybe it's in a different system altogether, like we said earlier. On the total charity care tab, the total charge column should equal or really exceed potentially the sum of the total patient payments, third-party payments, patient charity care, and other contractual. Are there any instances where this is not the case, and why? Is an amount perhaps reported in 2 columns for some reason? Maybe both of them were non-allowable columns anyways, but we need to understand what caused it, and so we can account for it essentially, or adjust it if necessary. How did you ensure that S10 line 20 column 2 only contains deductibles, coinsurance, and copay, except for those couple things that we're going to talk about that are allowed? Number 14, do you use presumptive eligibility for charity care? If it's in your policy, this is allowable for charity care. And here we're talking using credit reports, using third-party scorers. That's allowable for charity care. That is still not allowable for Medicare bad debt to take the place of an indigence determination. CMS has been adamant about that. Number 15 is it shouldn't really be an issue anymore. The HRSA funds ran out of funds before most of the years have started. So it's still there, but it'll be removed for the next period. Payments, again, there are only a couple questions here. And we wanted to make sure you understand what those patients should be. And this is in provider's best interest to fully understand this. This should generally not be a large amount. Now, remember, this line 22 carves out, or it reduces the amount of eligible charity care. So the higher this number, the lower your charity care allowable amount is going to be. So we want to make sure you're not hurting yourself with this number. That's the point. This should only be payments that were made against a prior period's charity care and the hospital accepted it still. It's kind of like the idea of a recovery of a bad debt. It offsets the amount. And yeah, that's that. So 18, just some bad debt questions. A lot of the same bad debt questions that as we had charity care. Make sure they're in the right period of write-off. And, oh yeah, 19. So this is a difference in timing. Are there Medicare bad debts reported in the total on line 26 of S10 that are claimed in a different cost reporting period on E-Part A or E-Part B? This may very well happen. Line 26 is all about your general ledger write-off against accounts receivable. That may not be the same period that you are able to write it off for Medicare bad debts. Maybe it's still the collection agency. It's been written off internally on your ledger, but it's not been written or it's not been returned from the collection agency. That's your biggest one that's going to delay it. So maybe it doesn't come back until the next year. And at that point, you can put it on E-Part A. That's all we're saying here is there might be a difference in time. I will be the first to admit that the mechanism CMS built on the cost reporting instructions to kind of reconcile these doesn't work. It's not 100% logical, but there really wasn't a better way to get at what they were wanting to do. And in most cases, it works fine. It's just when you have a big change in 1 year that can cause some trouble. Line 20, again, the duplicates. Here we have transaction codes. And then a reconciliation. This goes back to what I was just saying a bit ago. Whatever is on line 26, we need some sort of reconciliation back to either your financial statements or your working trial balance to get an idea, basically to show that they closely relate to the amount. And we're not saying it has to be exact. This is not a perfection or a perfect reconciliation. And I do want to stress, though, we've said this multiple times, line 26, regardless of what the label says on the face of S10, it is not bad debt expense. It's bad debt write-offs. Under GAAP, those are two completely, they're different, but they're related items. They're different times. Bad debt expense is an estimate. Bad debt write-off is once a specific bad debt is identified and is actually written off of an accounts receivable. Different numbers, different time periods. Then we have the HRSA again, and just a few other overall questions. If your S10 amount has changed from the initial listing, just a brief explanation what might have happened. Maybe you found some new claims, maybe you carved out some claims, whatever. And the 25 is for you. Any other things you'd like to bring up? So that is quick and dirty on the S10 template. And again, there are some instructions here as well. Kind of walk through some of those things. And I do have a YouTube video out there going through that in a little more detail, a little bit slower. So let's get back to where we were before. Now we're into the cost reporting instructions. So that's by far the biggest piece we have left. Largely, they're the same as they were last year and for the past few years, but there are a couple of very big distinctions. Now, one good thing is that if anybody remembers reading the cost reporting instructions up to a few years ago, the presentation of them, it was hard to really read through. because things weren't bullet pointed, they weren't separated out, they were all stuck in one paragraph. It just makes it hard on the eyes. So they definitely cleaned that up. But the reason they cleaned it up was really more of necessity, because now there's a third section for each instruction, a third time period of different sets of instructions. So if they would not have cleaned that up, it would be an absolute nightmare. It's still very complex just because of how much there is and the fact that you need to focus in on that period. And in fact, right here, I'm going to open up the cost reporting instructions and show you what I'm talking about. But there are 3 separate time periods of instructions for your line 20 and line 26. And in line 22, they had a couple time periods. So there's before 10.1.16, there's from 10.1.16 to 10.1.22, and then there's on or after 10.1.22. So let me open up those instructions and show you what I'm talking about here. Oh, of course. Never fails. Well, let me open that up again here, just a second. And while we're waiting on it, while we're waiting on it, we'll start talking again. And once that happens, a million errors start popping up. Never fails. Okay, so again, the 2 different time frames there, or 3 different time frames. And we're obviously on the 10.1.22 and after time frame. And let me move to the next slide while I'm waiting for that to pop up. Those were T18. That transmittal 18 we're talking about, that was effective on or after 10.1.22. Again, much more clearly organized. We're actually on transmittal 23 today, the hospital cost reporting instructions. Nothing major has changed since 18 for S-10 at least. Okay, now let's see if we can get where I was. Well, you know what? Dang it. I'm just going to open up a shell. Is that trying to search for that other one? So we just want to get the instructions. That's all I'm trying to show here. I have some screenshots for the rest of it. So if we take a look at the S10 instructions, by the way, the first 19 lines are not related to what we're dealing with. So you'll need them for filing, but we're not going to audit those. The only thing that really even comes into play is line 1, which is a flow number anyways. It's your cost to charge ratio. Here's where the S10 instructions really there's this kind of intro section that applies really to all years. It just generally tells you what amounts are not allowable, amounts that are not in your policy, courtesy discounts, deductible and co-insurance that are actually bad debts, physician and professional, or charges reported in a previous cost reporting period. If you've already reported them and allowed them, then of course they can't be claimed twice. This is just talking about the rejection if it doesn't have the template we talked about. And now they've broken it into A, B, and C, which are the different time periods. So for right now, we're just going to focus on the C, on or after 10.1.22. And you'll see there's column 1 and column 2. They specifically tell you what is allowable and what is not. It's a lot cleaner than it used to be. And I'm going to come back to these in a bit. I'm just quickly running through them while we have it live. Line 21, this is just showing the cost. This is a flow number. It's bringing those charity care charge amounts down to a cost portion. Then line 22 is offsetting that with any of those payments we talked about. And notice it gives you the time periods for how the payments should be reported. And then 23 basically carves those payments out and gets you the net number. 24 and 25 and 25.01 we'll talk about in just a bit. That's it. If you haven't used it yet, if you think you might have these, it's probably a good idea to read through these instructions, but hopefully what we talk about here might help to clarify them even further. So I'm going to move this to the side for now. And it is an important one. There have been some questions, but there is a, oh, you know what? It's not going to show me because I don't have a period in here, but there's a part 1 and a part 2. I'm just going to show you, you know what? Dang it. Let's see if I can find that template I had. It crashed on me at the wrong time. Ah. You know what? That's going to take too long to find it. I'm going to waste time there. But anyways, there's a part 1 and a part 2. And let me see if the instructions currently show it, even though I don't have a time. Yeah, they do, even though I don't have a fiscal year in there. So if you go to the instructions, part 1 is what we've been auditing all along. That's the hospital and the hospital complex. In other words, all your subunits and everything. And it's obviously a subset of what you've already reported in part 1. It's just carved out, it's carved down to just the hospital. We've asked CMS about this for a few different times. You know, is something going to change with this? Are you going to use it? At this point, they are not going to, but I suspect at some point down the road, if they like the data better, they might be moving over to this, but we assume they're going to give us all plenty of notice. So the point is, we're not auditing part 2. You don't have to fill out a template for part 2. The only time we might adjust part 2, and you'd probably need to adjust it on your side, is if for some reason a certain line of S10, well, let's say we adjusted part 1. We adjusted it, and maybe it disallowed half of it or quite a bit of it for some reason. That same line of part 2, if that amount is now above what's in part 1 for that same line, that obviously makes no sense. You cannot have more on the hospital side than you do on the entire hospital complex side. It makes no sense. So that's the only time we would be adjusting this or really even looking at it until we hear otherwise from CMS. So that's the other piece I wanted to point out there. It's all stated there. So here's just an illustration of the time frames. We already looked at them, so nothing more to talk about there. And let's see, where are we here? Oh, the overview. That's the other thing that's important. We have a part 1 and a part 2, but now all the overview of S10 itself is found in this little section of the instructions above those 2 pieces. It's all the definitions, the terminology, all of that. So let's talk about last line, but they don't use 31, they use 30. It's the cost of uncompensated care, which is basically your charity care from line 23, the cost of charity care, plus the underlying cost estimate of bad debts, both Medicare and non-Medicare on line 29. So now we'll break down those 2 lines. Oops. Line 20 is the input line that eventually gets us down to line 23. It's the main input line, I should say. Now, remember, we talked about line 25 and 25.01. 25 has been around. 25.01 is brand new, but they serve the same basic purpose. They're just 2 different groups of not allowable charges. Now, I'm going to reiterate this multiple times because it's so important. If you end up having something in line 25 or 25.01, that amount must still be part of this, like amount would be deductibles and coinsurance and copays. And those by definition do not get subject to a cost to charge ratio. They don't get reduced down to cost because they're not a charge to start with. However, if you have something in line 25 and 25.01, these are charges. So this $20,000 here of this $541,000 is a charge amount. And behind the scenes, the cost report basically says, okay, we'll subject just this $20,000 to the cost to charge ratio, but the other $521,000 is not going to be reduced. So that's where this number comes in, this line 21. If you, let's say you did not have anything in this line at all, 25 or 25.01, then this 541,000 would be right down here as well because there's no reduction. The fact that something's down here says that line 21 is going to be a little bit less than 541,000. This 20,000, this whole 20,000 is not going to make it down to 21. Only the underlying cost portion of this 20,000 is going to be included in line 21. So that's the purpose for it. By the way, there's a line 24, which is just a switch. You have to enter yes if you're going to fill these two fields or either of these fields out. So the other thing is the way this used to be done for at least this line 25.01 is to simply say, well, let's just carve that 20,000 out of here, period, and move it over to column 1, which is subject to the cost to charge ratio. That's the way a lot of these things used to be done. But now CMS wants them done with this little mechanism. So that's where that is. We'll cover that again in just a bit. And then again, line 22, if you did have some patient payments, that further offsets your allowable cost of charity care on line 23. Now, line 26, by the time we get down there, we're talking about bad debts, total bad debts, Medicare and non-Medicare. And this amount should match the amount of write-offs you had, of course, net of recoveries, but the write-offs on your general ledger, excluding things like physician or fee schedule that were not allowable elsewhere. So it might not perfectly match what you have on your general ledger as write-offs. And when I say general ledger, I have to be careful there because there's no bad debt, assuming you're using the allowance method for bad debts versus the direct write-off method, which is not GAAP approved in the most parts. Assuming you're using that, then there is really no bad debt write-off account per se on the general ledger. It's a derived amount. It's a reconciled amount between a few different elements that we'll see in just a bit. So the point is, these are write-offs, regardless of whether some of those were allowable on Medicare or not this year. And down here, when we get to 27 and 27.01, these are the amounts from the Medicare E-Part A, E-Part B, all the other settlement worksheets, and these are the Medicare bad debt amounts. The reason they're brought over here is to help us identify out of this 11.4 million, approximately how many of them are non-Medicare allowed, period. Because anything that is Medicare allowed, it's already been reduced. We don't allow the entire 100%. It's subject to that 65%, down to 65% reduction. So that one's not going to be subject to the cost to charge ratio, but all non-Medicare bad debts are subject to the cost to charge ratio. I know that's a contentious point that's been brought up with CMS in the past. They've dug their heels in that it is that way right now, been that way since the beginning. And then in line 29, you end up getting the cost of non-Medicare bad debts and the non-reimbursable Medicare bad debt amounts, the other 35% that was reduced. That's the portion that's left to be included along with this charity care for your potential uncompensated care payment. So a lot of that's done behind the scenes. The only thing we need to look at is line 26 and make sure it reconciles closely to your general ledger and make sure the proper things were carved out proper periods, all of that. This slide I've kind of went through it fairly quickly, but it shows you the logic for how we get down to that line 29. So basically, again, they've already been reduced. So now we'll dig into the lines specifically. We already looked at the instructions briefly, but we're going to see exactly what should be reported. Now, keep in mind, we're in 10.122. I have this reminder a few times, so make sure you're in the right section of the instructions. It would have been great if they would have bolded the periods, just in my mind, because it's very easy. It's still a big section. It's very easy to get in the wrong place, but maybe they'll do that next time. Just make sure you're on the right period. So let's talk about line 20, column 1, uninsured charity care charges. Again, uninsured by their nature. Just uninsured patients going in, maybe making some payment, maybe making none, maybe just a portion. But here is where the complication comes in. And if you remember those bullet points under each of these lines, that's what I'm talking about right here. In addition to fully uninsured patients, it's also going to include a few things. Charges for patients that technically have insurance, they have an insurance policy, but that insurance company does not have a contractual relationship with the provider. So it's as if they don't have insurance. They do, but they don't for this provider. So they're uninsured for all intents and purposes, for our intents, I should say. Or if you have a charge for an insured patient and they're covered by this provider, but for some reason they've been determined to be uninsured for this entire hospital stay. Now, what this would generally mean is that they've exhausted their benefits before this stay. It's not a partial claim that's allowed. The entire thing's not allowable because they've just exhausted their benefits before they even got here, this claim. There might be other reasons why they're uninsured for the entire hospital stay. Maybe every single service, even though they have coverage, every single service they got was not allowable. So again, they're uninsured for the entire stay. That's key. It's going to be different than what we'll see on column 2. And the one that's odd is charges for Medicaid non-covered services, if it's allowed by your charity care policy. So the reason this is odd is that now we basically have 3 different things related to Medicaid. We have the length of stay limit, we have Medicaid non-covered services, and we'll actually see that there might be a Medicaid share of cost that the patient was supposed to pay and they didn't. That might make its way over to column 2, which we'll see in just a bit. So it's just really interesting. I really wish they would have handled it, just split the entire thing, all of those issues, split it, move it over here to column 1. But apparently they have their reason for not doing that. So all 3 of these items can only be allowable if your policy clearly allows it. Here are those bullet points. So that's what we talked about just a bit ago. And of course, it has to be written off that period. And I left this verbiage from pre-2016. We're so far past that hopefully everybody understands that piece now. The very earliest instructions talked about using service dates to determine when things were reported. That has not been the case for a number of years. It's write-off date. Doesn't matter when the service date took place. And furthermore, we're reporting the full charge to start with and then backing out the amounts that are not allowable to get to the charity care portion. Now, regardless of what your policy says, CMS has mandated that courtesy discounts and physician professional services are not allowable. Self-pay or uninsured discounts, as long as they're in your policy, they can be allowable. Here's another rule that CMS brought up a while back. If the payment and the charity care write-off took place in the same day, or it's not same day, same year, same period, instead of reporting one as a charity care on line 20 and then the other as a payment on line 22, they want to see both of them removed. They want to see the net amount as of the end of that year. Now we're still in column 1. So here's what I was saying a bit ago. This is the one remaining piece that's going to be split between column 1 and column 2. One claim split between column 1 and column 2. If you have a Medicaid patient that comes in and there's a non-covered portion of that charge, but some of the other portion might have been covered, the non-covered charge portion is going to be in column 1 as uninsured. The portion of the claim that was covered and was a Medicaid share of cost that they were really supposed to pay, the patient was supposed to pay it, if you still end up allowing it as charity care, that portion would be in column 2 because they were technically insured, it was technically covered, it was just their share of that coverage. Very similar to the idea of a deductible, coinsurance, or copay, only on the Medicaid side. This is the only thing anymore that is split between column 1 and column 2, where one bill is split. And of course, anytime you have a split, there must be adequate documentation to show that. And as I said before, the other items that some of them might have been split before, they're no longer split. We have that line 25 and 25.01, and that covers when we have that Medicaid length of stay limit that's exceeded, and that's why it's not covered. Or if you have that partially insured patient where they've exhausted benefits halfway through the stay, part of it's covered, part of it's not covered. That's what line 25.01 is now for. So column 1, I guess you could say it's kind of the easier of the two now. But if we get to column 2, we're talking about insured, or at least the insured portion. Again, 10/1/22 is the time frame. So again, the bulk of column 22 or column 2 of line 20 is for just easily, obviously insured patients, whether it be private or public coverage. If they're insured, they go in column 2. And for the most part, this is going to be your coinsurance, deductible, copay, Medicaid cost share, whatever term you want to use. So that's the bulk of it. But again, they added some complexity with that line 25 and 25.01, and we do need to separate them. So line 25 it's been around since the beginning of our audits. This is a relatively limited situation where you have, it's called a capitation limit or a length of stay limit. But if you have a Medicaid patient or another indigent care program, a local indigent care program, where they were covered up to a certain number of days and then they've exceeded that length of stay limit, that excess amount is no longer covered. Part of it was covered, and now this extra part is not. In this situation, for line 20, column 2 specifically, you're going to have, for that entire claim, part of it will relate to the Medicaid cost sharing amount that is now charity care. That amount that we're allowing, it's a charge. Or no, I'm sorry, it's a cost share amount. It's not a charge. It's a cost share amount. And then the other portion would be the non-covered charge. It's the portion outside of the length of stay limit. So you can see with one claim, part of it's charged, part of it's not charged. That's where the confusion comes up. But again, that entire amount would be reported in line 20, column 2. Part of the claim was charged, part of the claim was not charged. Both things go in there. So you're commingling a charge and a non-charge item in one cell. That line 25 is where we kind of carve that out, or we tell the system how to carve it out. Maybe that's a better way of putting it. Whatever charge portion you included for that claim in line 20, column 2, it also needs to be reported in line 25. Again, do not remove it from line 20, column 2 and just move it down here. That's wrong, and that'll hurt your numbers. Leave it in here and then report just the charge portion in line 25. So now the other thing, this is the line 25.01. This is when you have, and I think the label's pretty brief, but it says there might be a portion of charges other than deductible, coinsurance, or copayment that represents a patient's liability for non-covered services. And we're not talking Medicaid anymore. We're talking a regular insurance company. They've exhausted some sort of benefits. They hit some sort of limit midway through the stay. The first part of the claim is perfectly covered. It's deductible, coinsurance, whatever. And then part of it is not covered. It might even be just specific services that that insurance company did not cover, but they covered the rest of it. So any of those things that are not covered, just like with that Medicaid length of stay issue, the charge portion of the non-covered piece is going to be commingled with the coinsurance, deductible, and copay of the covered piece, put in the same column. But again, the portion of line 20, column 2 that was charge related for non-covered needs to be copied, not moved, but actually duplicated down in line 25.01 so that the system knows out of this one cell behind the scenes how much should they subject to the cost to charge ratio. So again, this line 25 and 25.01, it is CMS's alternative to simply having every partial coverage claim split between the two columns. This is their alternative mechanism. So, and there's the instructions for that. We pretty much covered it there. Again, only write-offs in that cost reporting period. If the payment took place in the same year, eliminate them both. Courtesy discounts not allowable, physician professional services, just like before. And again, we talked about even though Medicare is insurance, and by definition, the amount that we would allow as a Medicare bad debt started out as a deductible or coinsurance. So it fits the bill for line 20, column 2 initially. When you just look at the type that it is, it's a charity care, or I'm sorry, it's a coinsurance or deductible that relates to an insured patient. And often the word indigent bad debt, or the phrase indigent bad debt, is used synonymously with charity care, even though that's really not correct technically, and it's for this reason among others. They might use the same policy, but they're two distinct things. One's a bad debt that we're allowing, the other is actually a charity care amount. Well, I shouldn't say contra revenue. They're both contra revenues now under GAAP, but we'll leave that for another discussion. The point is, generally speaking, Medicare patients should not be included here because they're more likely to be Medicare bad debts that you'd have already written off, again, as probably indigent Medicare bad debts. And that piece is already going to be flowing down to S10 line 26. It's going to be part of that. So we can't see them in both places. So if we see a Medicare patient up here in line 20, it's a red flag. But if you can support that there's a reason you did not write it off as a Medicare bad debt, then there's nothing really barring it from being in line 20, column 2. We just want to make sure it wasn't duplicated. And this is a high risk of duplication. We've already gone through the template here. And then payments. I think we've hammered the payments quite a bit. Again, just make sure you're not overstating that number. It's only things where a charity care write-off took place, the patient or their family still came in and wanted to pay that amount, and the hospital accepted it against a prior charity care write-off. That's what line 22 is for. We already talked about not allowing both in the same year, just exclude both of them. And here's a kind of a lengthy example, but I think is not what we want to see on line 22. That's a valid payment against a true liability they have. They were written off for $750 in this case. Again, if they pay up to that $250, we're not going to see that anywhere. That's not related to charity care at all. That was their balance. But if they paid $850 in 2023, which was more than the $250 they owed, and notice it's the same year. That's the other important thing. We're going to reduce line 20 by $600. That's after carving out the $250 that was a true payment. That's basically telling us, hey, they paid $600 against their $750 charity care. We want to exclude it from the line 20, and we do not want to report it in line 22. That was that instruction I mentioned a few times. The first 250 was not even charity care. That was their liability. The next 600 was related to charity care, but that same year. So we want to exclude both sides of it. And only the there's $150 left as charity care out of all that amount and no payment amount. Now let's say they paid another $150 in 2024. We're not going to adjust charges in 23 or 24, but now this $150 clearly goes toward charity care because they already covered their $250 payment before, the amount they actually owed. So now anything in addition is going to offset a charity care amount. Now it's a prior year charity care amount it's offsetting. That's when you finally get this amount that goes on line 22, assuming, again, that you did not refund the amount back to the patient, obviously. So there's our payment template. And then we'll talk maybe a little bit more about these again. It's just such a convoluted mechanism that I really want to make sure we cover it adequately. So line 24, if you're going to have these two things, you have to change this to yes, otherwise it won't even allow these. It certainly won't calculate them. 24, just to reiterate, if you have charges for portions of claims that are beyond the Medicaid length of stay limit, those charges go here, and you need to make sure this 7,500 was also included up here. The exact same thing applies to 25.01, but it's for the insured patient's liability. In other words, the amount they owed, there was not, and here's the thing, this is somewhat of a misnomer, well, somewhat, because part of their liability is obviously co-insurance and deductible, which belongs in line 20 to begin with. But here they're specifying this is any charge amount related to a liability that wasn't covered. That part of the claim wasn't covered. The charge goes here, and make sure that same 12,500 is part of this 541 in line 20. So I think we've covered that enough. We've got quite a bit of verbiage. We've repeated it a few times. Here's just maybe a summary of the other three things we might see here. If it's a Medicaid and it has specific services that are not covered, you're going to split that. That's one of the things you're going to split between column 1 and column 2. If it's non-covered due to there's no contractual relationship with the hospital, actually that's not split. That's all in column 1. Sorry about that misnomer or misstatement. And if it's non-covered for the entire stay, there's certainly no split needed. It's all in column 1. I'll touch on bad debts. We got about 12 minutes left. Bad debts there's nothing major that's changed here. There's only one column. They still don't have an uninsured or insured split. And as I mentioned before, that's a contentious point that's been brought up in the Federal Register a few times. What that basically means is all of the non-Medicare bad debts are subject to a cost-to-charge ratio, even though some of them might not have been insured patients. Or I'm sorry, they might not have been uninsured patients. So it might not really be a charge amount, yet it's still being subject to the cost-to-charge ratio. The biggest answer CMS gives about that is that since the rule's being applied consistently across the board, and it's a zero-sum game, basically, if one goes above, one provider gets a higher percentage, the other provider gets a lower percentage. So the point is, if it's done consistently, it shouldn't really have that major of an impact. But maybe at some point they'll change the mechanism to report that, but they have not at this point. And furthermore, in the past or the earlier years, we had some providers that tried to do an off the schedule calculation and just kind of report that adjusted number, so to speak, it wasn't truly the bad debt write-off number, we certainly can't allow that, because then again, you'd have a consistency issue. One provider would be getting a benefit, which hurts the other providers. So same instructions, amounts written off during this period has to be offset by recoveries, no physician or professional services. And again, we want to make sure one of our big steps when we're going through the audit program is checking for duplicates, because that's an obvious error. If the same claim, same amount is reported in two different columns, you're getting basically double paid. So if the amount was written off as charity care, if we see that same claim in both the charity care and the bad debt listing, or in this year's charity care listing and one of last year's listings, that's a huge red flag, because it looks like a duplicate. What we might see is that maybe it's a partial claim. And if we can identify that half the claim was here and half the claim was in the other place, no problem there, but it's a red flag to start with. Now, if you did have a reversal in the same period where maybe you started, yeah, you could start either way, start charity care and then turn it to a write-off in that period. Both the reversal has to happen in the same period. Another thing CMS has brought up is that any reclassification, like reestablishment of an account and then writing it off again in a later year, we cannot allow those. We cannot allow a reinstated account that's already been reported in one year, and now it's going to be reported as something else in the next year. That's something CMS has been adamant about, also fairly recently. Not as recently as the template discussion, but pretty recently. Here we talked about the bad debt. It'd be very, very coincidental for that to be exactly the same amount as your bad debt expense in your working trial balance. Unheard of, basically. So if we see that, that's the biggest red flag you'll ever see, and we'll ask questions about that. Again, the bad debt expense on your financial statements is an accrual estimate under the allowance method, and the line 26 should be the actual write-off once you know specifically which accounts are not reimbursable. Different time periods, different amounts. Now, as far as reconciliation, this little illustration is pretty darn old. This was something I put together way back at the beginning to help people try to understand maybe what a reconciliation might look like, the different things it needs to take into consideration. If you have a different version of it that accounts for every item that you need, that's perfectly fine. It does not have to match this identically, but we need some reconciliation to show how you arrived at that write-off amount, basically. Another way of doing it is, if in your system, if you can grab on to write-off entries and make sure you've carved out write-off entries related to physician and all those other non-allowable services, that would be perfectly fine as well. We just need to have some assurance that this is truly a write-off and not some derivative of an expense or something like that. Bad debt listing there. So now we're down to kind of the wrap-up pieces. We've hit this multiple times, and it even references an old 2020 letter that was sent out. It's in their audit program, even though we can't show it. It's part of their audit program that it must be allowable or must be included in your charity care policy for it to be allowable. So we have to look at the charity care policy, look for verbiage about all those different scenarios. We were able to give a management letter and a warning back in 2020, and even the next year if you didn't have enough time to implement it. But we're now certainly in the time period where if something's not specified in your policy, it's not allowable. Now you got to remember, CMS is being very lenient on these compared to, for example, Medicare bad debts, indigent bad debts. There are very, very stringent policies for Medicare indigent bad debts, but for the charity care side, with just a couple of exceptions, they basically say, hey, provider, whatever you have in your policy, As long as you apply it consistently and as long as it's specified, it's allowable. So we have to make sure it's in your policy. That's what it boils down to. Now, submitting documentation through the file exchange. So it's the same as it's been for a number of years. Here is our website for that. And we also have instructions on our own Medicare website, WPS website as well. In fact, if you just search for file exchange or secure EDI, you'll come to that audit article. But the key thing to remember here, as I said earlier, is you just need to contact the auditor that you want to submit the data to. They'll send you that initiation email to get you set up. If you're a brand new user or if it's expired long ago, you'll get a new password. And if you ever need to reset your account, your password or whatever, you can contact that auditor. Every auditor has the ability to do that on our side. In the few situations where something is really broken, then they can pass it on to our help desk if they need to. Here is where you'll find it on the WPS website. It's under self-service, audit, secure EDI, file exchange. That gives you information on it, including a YouTube video that's linked to it. Here's that information again. File size, it's much bigger than normal email. No file type restrictions. You can zip it if you want, but it's not required. It'll keep the file name. So all that stuff, that's the benefits of this secure EDI system. The drawback is that it's not a normal email system and it won't stay there forever. Now this goes both ways. In fact, it has, I think maybe a 30-day, I forget what it was, a 30-day limit, and then the information's gone. It just gets purged. So you definitely, if you get something from the auditor, you need to grab it quickly. A couple of final points as we're wrapping up here. We talked about duplicates. We've already talked about this quite a bit. It's one of the things we check on. So if you do have those partial claims, that's what that query logic questionnaire is about, that question that asked about that. Now, sampling. So the way we have this set up, when we do need to do it, after we've cleaned everything up front, we have to detail test. We'll request a sample. We try to keep this to as minimal of a number as we can while still being statistically valid. But the other thing about it is we know that depending on what we find during the detailed test, when we plug it back into the system, it may now all of a sudden say, well, now you need another unit or two because it's no longer statistically valid. The variances between the units of the population have changed so much that now it's no longer statistically valid. We need to test more to get the reasonable assurance we need. To avoid or to minimize multiple requests, we select some spares, just a small handful of spares up front, and we request the entire thing with the hope that that will at least cover what we need. Not saying it'll always cover it. We might still need a few more, but it should significantly cut that number down. And yeah, we talked about the charity care. That's repeated yet again. The split, that 25 and 25.01. We talked about, this is, I guess, an important point. The line 26, the instructions are written kind of oddly. It's intending to say that, hey, this line 26 is both Medicare and non-Medicare patients, bad debts. They have to be written off against accounts receivable. But what you cannot do is take a listing from your system of non-Medicare patients and then just go and add in the E-Part A, E-Part B amounts and bring them over. That's not allowable because it doesn't necessarily match the right period. Some of those Medicare bad debts might have been written off on your general ledger last year, and now they're just making it to be written off for Medicare this year after they come back from the collection agency. So we can't see something like that. We need to see an actual listing from your general ledger with the corresponding reconciliation. We talked about payments plenty, I believe. And with just a couple minutes to spare, just a reminder, we have some available resources here. The website, the YouTube channel, our templates. And we're down to the survey link. I want to go back to the beginning here, and I'm going to copy it again and paste it in the chat area. So that might be, oops, what's that saying? Unable to send message. That's not good. Try it one more time. There we go. I think that, no, it didn't go through again. Huh. Well, that's blocking me. But if you go back to the beginning of the chat, you should be able to see that post. And you could also find it in the documentation I sent, both the email and obviously the PowerPoints. But if you have a few minutes to take that, we'd certainly appreciate that to get your feedback on that. And with that, I know we had some good questions throughout, and I'll just open it up and see if there are any other questions anybody might have on what we've talked about so far. Okay. Well, if there are no questions, I just wanted to thank you for your time, and I hope you've gained something out of this training. As I said, I'll be posting the video to our YouTube channel as soon as I can here in the next few days, by the end of the weekend for sure, and I'll be sending the email out. So thanks again. I hope everybody has a great week, and I will talk to you in our next webinar. Have a good one.